Black woman mocked at shooting range by U.S. General. Unaware she is a legendary sniper. Aaliyah Thompson stood on the edge of the shooting range, the rifle in her hands feeling both foreign and familiar at the same time. She adjusted her grip, fingers pressing firmly around the cold metal as her breath slowed. The early morning mist clung to the air, thick with the weight of the challenge ahead. It wasn't the first time she had faced skepticism, nor would it be the last. But today, as she stepped onto this unfamiliar terrain, Aaliyah knew it would be different. Today, the mocking voices of the past would be silenced by the crack of her rifle. There was no mistaking the undertone of the laughter that rippled through the group gathered nearby. Aaliyah could feel the stares, the eyes that looked at her as if she didn't belong. Her chest tightened for a moment, but she quickly forced herself to steady. She had grown used to this. The doubts, the glances, the way people underestimated her, believing that a woman, let alone a black woman, couldn't possibly be capable of the same feats that others could achieve. She had encountered this all her life, and yet, there she was again, standing in front of them. But this time, it wasn't just the sneers that would be different. It was the outcome. The sound of a voice cut through the chatter, drawing everyone's attention. It was a commanding tone, authoritative, unmistakably military. General Mark Anderson stood at the forefront of the group, his tall frame towering over the others, a confident smirk etched onto his face. He had earned his rank and his words carried weight. He believed in his own superiority more than anything, and like so many others in the camp, he didn't believe that Aaliyah belonged here. Look, a monkey with a gun. The general's voice rang out across the range, loud enough for everyone to hear, and the laughter that followed was swift and sharp. The words cut through Aaliyah like a knife. She froze for just a moment, feeling the heat of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. But she quickly masked the emotion, letting it wash over her without a reaction. She couldn't let him see how deeply his words affected her, but that didn't mean she wasn't stung. It wasn't the first time she had been humiliated, nor would it be the last. But somehow today his mocking words felt like the universe's cruelest joke. Aaliyah had been practicing for years, honing her skills with a sniper rifle that many others would never even touch. She had earned every bit of her place in this camp, and yet, here she was, reduced to a punchline. The laughter from the others only seemed to amplify the ache, the sting of their collective doubt. Aaliyah's grip tightened around the rifle. This was a test, not just of her skills, but of her resolve. She had been tested before by life, by the system, by every person who had ever told her she wasn't good enough, strong enough, or capable enough. This was no different. She had learned to stand tall in the face of mockery, to ignore the insults and rise above them. But today, something inside her shifted. She had spent too long proving herself to others, allowing their perceptions to dictate her actions. This time she wasn't doing it for them. She was doing it for herself. The range officer gave the signal, and the group began to move into position, but Aaliyah remained still, standing with a sense of quiet determination that no one could see, but she could feel in the pit of her stomach. She hadn't come here to prove anything to the general or anyone else. She had come to prove to herself that she belonged. She had come to show the world that the moment they laughed at her would be the moment they would never forget. She could feel the weight of the rifle in her hands, the way it felt like an extension of herself. It wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of every hour spent training alone, every night when the world slept and she stayed awake, perfecting her aim. It was the culmination of years of self-discipline and dedication. And now, it was time to make sure the world saw what she was capable of. Aaliyah took her place at the shooting line, her stance steady, her eyes narrowing on the distant target. She could hear the murmurs from the crowd, but she ignored them, blocking out everything but the task at hand. The only sound she allowed herself to focus on was the rhythmic breathing that came in and out of her chest. The tension of the moment hung heavy in the air, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. This wasn't about the soldiers who mocked her. This wasn't about the general. This was about proving something far more important, to herself. The first shot rang out with a satisfying crack. Her aim was true, the bullet hitting the target with deadly precision. Aaliyah didn't even look at it. She was already resetting, moving on to the next shot. Her hands were steady. Her breath was steady. Every shot seemed to cut through the noise, cutting through the laughter, the mockery, and the disbelief that had followed her since she first walked onto the camp. She wasn't the woman they thought she was. She wasn't the joke. She wasn't the target of their mockery. She was something entirely different. As the rounds continued, Aaliyah's focus sharpened. The pressure from the general's earlier words no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like fuel. Each shot she took was another blow against the years of being underestimated, of being told she didn't belong. And with every bullet that hit the target, the general's smugness seemed to waver just for a moment. He tried to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't ignore what was unfolding before him. The other soldiers watched, their eyes flicking between Aaliyah and the target, the disbelief on their faces slowly turning into something else. Respect. She wasn't just hitting the target. She was surpassing their expectations, exceeding everything they had thought possible. Aaliyah's fingers moved with the kind of precision that could only come from years of practice, years of quiet dedication to a craft that few would ever understand. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acknowledgement. She had never needed anyone's validation. What mattered now was the feeling of the rifle in her hands, the steady rhythm of her heart, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she was in control. The final round came, and as she steadied herself for the last shot, Aaliyah's eyes remained fixed on the target, her mind clear, focused. When she pulled the trigger, the sound seemed to echo through the entire camp, the bullet hitting its mark with a perfection that could only come from someone who had dedicated every moment of their life to mastering this skill. The camp went silent. The laughter that had once filled the air was now replaced with stunned silence. The soldiers around her exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The general stood at the back, his face unreadable. Aaliyah knew he didn't expect this, but then again, he never would. Aaliyah stood still for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. This was more than just hitting targets. This was more than just proving herself on the shooting range. This was a moment of quiet triumph. A moment where everything that had ever been said about her, everything that had ever been assumed, had been shattered. She hadn't just hit the target. She had hit something far more important. She had hit back at every person who had ever doubted her, and that was enough. The days that followed Aaliyah's performance on the shooting range passed in a blur of silent glares, murmurs, and barely concealed surprise. She didn't seek attention. She never did. But it was impossible to ignore the shift in the air. Even the general who had once mocked her so openly now kept his distance. It wasn't fear that changed his demeanor, no, it was respect. It was something far more uncomfortable for a man who had spent his career belittling others, convinced of his own superiority. But Aaliyah wasn't interested in any of that. She wasn't concerned with their newfound wariness or their grudging respect. What mattered to her now was the next challenge, the next step, and the one after that. She had shown them once that she belonged, but she needed to prove it again, to herself. The Sniperr competition that loomed ahead wasn't just another exercise. It wasn't simply a way to pass the time or fill the hours. It was a test, a final measure of everything she had worked for. If she could dominate that competition, she wouldn't just be a name on a roster. She would be someone they could never forget. Someone who wasn't defined by anyone's expectations but her own. The sounds of boots hitting the ground echoed in the morning air as Aaliyah made her way back to the range. She could feel the stares. They weren't the same as before. These weren't mocking, judgmental looks. They were different, curious, even respectful. But that didn't matter to her. Not anymore. She wasn't interested in their opinions. She was interested in becoming the best, and that meant ignoring the noise and focusing only on the task ahead. The morning light was beginning to slice through the clouds as Aaliyah approached the firing line. She could feel the weight of the rifle in her hands before she even picked it up, the familiar heaviness, the steady comfort of the weapon she had come to rely on so many times before. She wasn't just holding a gun. She was holding years of struggle, of sacrifice, of sleepless nights spent perfecting her craft in silence. It wasn't a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. She didn't do this for accolades or for praise. She did it because it was the only thing she had ever known how to do well. And in this world, in this camp, it was the one thing that could silence the doubts and the mockery. It was the one thing that could prove that she wasn't just another statistic. She wasn't just another woman who wouldn't make it. Aaliyah's hands were steady as she adjusted the scope on her rifle, checking the settings. Each click of the dial was another step in her process. She didn't rush. There was no need to hurry. The target wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't here to show off, to try and impress anyone. She was here to do what she had always done. hit the mark. As the others around her began to prepare for the competition, Aaliyah shut out the noise. She shut out the whispers, the glances, the expectations. It was just her and the rifle. She had done this 1,000 times before, and each time felt like the first. The adrenaline was always there, a steady hum beneath her skin, but it didn't consume her. It didn't cloud her judgment. The rest of the soldiers had gathered, their rifles resting at their sides. Some were adjusting their gear, others chatting quietly among themselves. But there was one noticeable difference now. Aaliyah was no longer invisible. She was the center of attention, even if she wasn't seeking it. The stares weren't just curious now. They were filled with something else. Something that resembled admiration, but was still wrapped in a layer of disbelief. It was as if the camp had come to the sudden realization that she wasn't just a woman with a gun. She was a sniper, a damn good one, and they had all underestimated her. The general, standing at the back of the group, no longer seemed like the imposing figure he had once been. Instead, he seemed almost small, like a man who had been caught out in his own arrogance. His eyes flickered to Aaliyah, and for the briefest moment she saw something in them that she hadn't expected. Hesitation, but she didn't allow herself to focus on him. She wasn't there for him. She wasn't there for anyone else. The only person Aaliyah needed to impress was herself. She adjusted the position of her feet on the ground, grounding herself, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, sharp, but it felt like the perfect moment, the quiet before the storm. She could feel the other competitors shifting around her, the weight of their eyes on her back, but she refused to acknowledge it. The only thing that mattered was the scope, the target, the shot. Aaliyah began to load the rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the bullet slide into place. She checked the scope again, making sure everything was aligned. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being precise. She didn't need to be the loudest. She didn't need to be the fastest. She just needed to be the one who hit her mark every single time. As the first round of shots rang out across the field, Aaliyah could feel the tension rise. The other soldiers were scrambling to get into position, eager to show off their own skills. The pressure was building, but it didn't affect her. She had already blocked it out. Her world had become a tiny, focused space. There was nothing outside of the crosshairs, nothing beyond the target in front of her. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out with a perfect crack, the sound echoing across the open field. Aaliyah didn't need to check. She already knew. It was dead center. The rest of the soldiers flinched, startled by the accuracy. Some whispered to one another while others stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Aaliyah didn't let herself feel satisfaction. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about proving that she had earned her place, and more than that, proving that no one had the right to question her abilities again. As she prepared for the next shot, Aaliyah heard footsteps approaching from behind. It was the general. She didn't turn around to face him, but she could feel his presence just behind her. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "Impressive shot," he said, almost begrudgingly. Aaliyah didn't respond. She didn't need to. His acknowledgement didn't matter. She wasn't there for his approval. She was there for her own. She was there to make sure that every doubt, every sneer, every cruel word that had been thrown her way was erased by the sound of her bullets hitting their mark. The competition continued. But for Aaliyah, it wasn't about the end result. It was about the journey, about the quiet moments of focus, about the rhythm of her breath and the steady click of the trigger. And as the competition wore on, she knew that no matter what, she had already won. She had proven something far more important than just her skills. She had proven that she was more than just the sum of the doubts others had placed on her. She was a sniper. She was a force to be reckoned with. And no one, not even the general, could ever take that away from her. The sun beat down harder the next morning, casting long shadows across the training field as Aaliyah stepped onto the range again. The atmosphere was different today. It wasn't just the stares or the quiet buzz of conversation. No, today felt heavier. The competition had officially begun, and everyone, soldiers and officers alike, watched closely. Every movement she made was observed, scrutinized, as though they were waiting for her to fail. They wanted to see if she could really do it, if she could match their expectations or exceed them, but Aaliyah wasn't worried about their eyes on her. She had learned long ago that worrying about what others thought would only slow her down. The focus was always on the task, on the shot, the target, the rhythm of breathing in and out. It was a game she had perfected in silence, a game that demanded not just skill but unwavering discipline. The general, Mark Anderson, stood at the edge of the group, his expression unreadable. He had watched her the day before, seen the way she hit every target with precision, and something had shifted inside him. He wasn't used to being wrong. He wasn't used to being outdone, especially by someone he had once dismissed so easily. But now, as the competition officially began, Aaliyah could feel his gaze burning into her back. Aaliyah could almost hear his thoughts of disbelief, of surprise that a black woman no less had outperformed him and the other soldiers. But none of that mattered now. She had proven her point to herself. She didn't need to prove anything to him or anyone else. All she had to do was focus on the task at hand, to shut everything out and do what she did best. The first round of the competition began, and Aaliyah stepped up to the line. Her heart didn't race. It never did. The adrenaline was there, but it didn't overwhelm her. It was just another step in a routine she had practiced for years. She adjusted her position, set her feet firm on the ground, and lifted the rifle. The rifle was a part of her now, an extension of herself molded by years of training, countless hours spent learning the nuances of the weapon, the feel of its trigger, the sound of the shot. She exhaled slowly, lining up the crosshairs with the target in the distance. She didn't look around at the other competitors. She didn't need to. She didn't care about their progress. It was her moment now. Her focus remained fixed, her grip steady as she lined up the perfect shot. The first shot was smooth, effortless almost, but that didn't mean it wasn't powerful. The bullet struck dead center, sending a visible shockwave through the surrounding competitors. There were gasps, some even applauding, but Aaliyah didn't hear them. Her focus had already shifted to the next target. The challenge had only just begun. The general's expression remained unchanged, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Aaliyah could see it in the corner of her eye, but she didn't acknowledge him. There was no need. He had expected this from her. After all, she had proven it once before. But now it was about consistency. It was about doing it over and over again. Aaliyah set herself up for the second shot. She wasn't aware of the murmurs that had started to spread among the soldiers, nor the silent respect that had started to grow in their eyes. They had seen the first shot, and now they were beginning to understand that this wasn't just luck. This wasn't a fluke. She was the real deal. The whispers of doubt were starting to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of recognition. She took another deep breath, steadying her hands, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and this time there was a distinct thud as the bullet found its mark. Another perfect hit. The soldiers around her began to take notice. Aaliyah was unfazed, moving to the next position with the same unhurried precision. The world around her seemed to slow, and the only thing that mattered was the target in front of her. With every shot, the distance between herself and the others widened. The other competitors, those who had once laughed and doubted her, began to fade into the background. They no longer mattered. What mattered was the rifle in her hands, the power of her steady aim, and the space she created between herself and anyone who had ever questioned her abilities. The general was no longer watching her with the same disdain. He had stopped pretending that he didn't see what was happening. He had stopped pretending that he wasn't impressed. But that wasn't enough for Aaliyah. She wasn't here for him. She wasn't here to prove a point to someone who had already made up his mind about her. She was here for herself, for the long nights spent alone perfecting her craft, for the battles she had fought in silence, for the years of being underestimated, only to rise again, stronger. The competition continued, but Aaliyah was already a step ahead. It wasn't just about hitting the targets, it was about hitting them with perfection. Each round was a reflection of the work she had put in, the quiet determination that had driven her to this point. There were no distractions, no nervousness, just the rifle, the target, and the steady beat of her heart. By the time the final round came, the other soldiers had begun to fall behind. Aaliyah's shots were so precise, so effortless, that it seemed as though she wasn't even trying. There were no dramatic pauses, no wasted movements. Every action was deliberate, measured, and flawless. She approached the final target with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the competition. It didn't matter how much time had passed. It didn't matter how many shots had been fired. It was just her, the rifle, and the target. Aaliyah adjusted her stance, her body already knowing what it had to do. She didn't need to think. She simply acted. She took a breath and exhaled slowly, the rifle steady in her hands. The world outside her focus seemed to disappear, leaving only the distant target in her sights. She pulled the trigger. A soft crack filled the air, followed by the distant thud of the bullet striking its mark. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if the world had just realized what had happened, the soldiers erupted into applause. But Aaliyah didn't react. She stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of what had just occurred. It wasn't the applause she was waiting for. It wasn't the recognition. It was something far simpler. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had done exactly what she came here to do. The general's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, but there was no hint of mockery now. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong to doubt her. He didn't speak, but the silence between them said everything. Aaliyah didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had already proven to herself that she was more than capable. She had proven that she belonged, and that, more than anything, was enough. The sound of boots crunching over the gravel was the only noise that broke the otherwise still morning air. Aaliyah stood at the edge of the field, watching the sun rise slowly, casting a golden hue across the training ground. The competition was over. The targets had been hit. The points had been tallied. And yet Aaliyah felt no exhilaration, no rush of victory. She felt only quiet certainty. Her hands, still steady from the rifle, now rested loosely at her sides. The air felt heavier now, as though the weight of everything that had happened hung around her like a thick fog. She had done it. She had proven herself, not to the others, not even to the general, but to herself. And that was all that mattered. As the soldiers around her began to congratulate one another, some with hearty slaps on the back, others with quiet nods of acknowledgement, Aaliyah felt disconnected from it all. She didn't need their praise. She had never needed it. She had spent years honing her skills in silence, away from the crowds, away from the spotlight. This moment was no different. But something in the air told her that this time things had changed. She turned her back on the celebration and walked slowly toward the small wooden shack that housed her gear. Her mind wasn't on the victory, but on what was to come next. Every time she achieved something, there was always a new challenge waiting, a new obstacle to face. This wasn't the end. It was only another beginning. She reached for her bag, zipping it open and rummaging through the contents. It wasn't the first time her hands had moved in this quiet rhythm, this practiced calm. She had spent so many hours like this, packing, preparing, knowing what was coming. The sound of footsteps behind her brought her attention back to the present. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The familiar heavy stride was unmistakable. General Anderson had arrived, his boots crunching against the ground as he approached. The way he moved, so sure of himself, made Aaliyah feel as though his presence filled the entire space. She stood still, waiting. She didn't need to look at him to know he was there, towering behind her like a shadow. His presence was overwhelming, but it didn't bother her. She had seen this look before, the kind of look someone gives when they realize they've underestimated you. The general's voice broke the silence, rough but controlled. "You've got an impressive shot, Thompson." His words were blunt, but Aaliyah could hear the shift in his tone. It was something she hadn't expected to hear. In the past, he had always been dismissive, condescending, anything but respectful. But now there was no sarcasm, no arrogance. Just a simple acknowledgement of what she had done. Aaliyah didn't turn to face him. "Thank you, sir," she replied quietly, her voice steady and measured as though it was nothing but routine. She hadn't come here for compliments, nor did she need validation. Her worth had never been tied to the approval of men who had never understood her. For a moment, there was silence between them, the only sound being the breeze rustling through the trees. The other soldiers were still cheering, congratulating each other on their performances. But Aaliyah felt a deep sense of detachment from all of it. She hadn't come here to fit in. She hadn't come here to prove anything to anyone else. She'd come to do one thing, prove that she was a force to be reckoned with. And she had done just that. General Anderson took a step closer, his boots thudding softly against the ground. "I thought you were just another recruit. I thought you'd falter like the rest. But I was wrong." His words were blunt, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, but Aaliyah could feel the weight of his admission. She finally turned to face him, locking eyes with the man who had once belittled her in front of the entire camp. The change in his demeanor was undeniable. The smirk that had once lingered on his lips was gone, replaced by something closer to respect. She had proven him wrong, and he couldn't hide it. But Aaliyah didn't feel a rush of satisfaction. She didn't feel like she had won. She simply felt calm. This was never about him. It was never about the general or the soldiers or the competition. It had always been about her, about the quiet fire inside her that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times it had been tried. "I didn't come here to make you think I'm good enough, sir," Aaliyah said softly, her words carrying a weight that she hadn't even meant to impose. "I came here to prove to myself that I can be better than anyone thought I could be." For the first time, General Anderson looked at her, not with pity, not with derision, but with something resembling understanding. The intensity in his gaze told her that he finally saw her for what she truly was. Not just a woman with a gun, but a sniper. A legend in the making. There was a long pause as the general took in her words, his silence saying more than his speech ever could. For a moment, Aaliyah wondered if he would say something more, something to break the tension that hung between them like a heavy mist. But he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded once, sharply, as though he had accepted something he hadn't been prepared to admit. "You've earned your place here," he said, his voice steady. "I won't forget that." Aaliyah said nothing. She didn't need to. She had already won. Not in the way others thought, not in the way the general had expected, but in the only way that mattered. She had proven her worth, not to anyone else but to herself. As he turned to leave, Aaliyah remained standing there, still and silent. She had heard the words. She had felt the shift in the air. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the quiet sense of fulfillment that bloomed in her chest. It wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing without a doubt that she had done it. She had pushed through every barrier that had been set before her, every doubt that had ever been cast on her abilities, and she had emerged on the other side, stronger, better, more certain of who she was. The sound of the general's footsteps faded into the distance as Aaliyah stood alone, the competition now nothing more than a distant memory. It wasn't the accolades or the approval that mattered to her. It was the knowledge that she had forged this path herself, one shot at a time, in the silence and the solitude. And as she walked away from the range, the weight of the rifle still heavy in her hands, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found their place in the world. Someone who knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they were capable of anything. The air was thick with the heavy weight of expectation, but for Aaliyah it no longer mattered. She had passed the test, or rather, she had redefined what it meant to be tested. The cheers from the other soldiers had long faded, replaced by the quiet hum of soldiers packing up, eager to return to their routines, as if the events of the past days had not upended their assumptions entirely. Yet Aaliyah stood motionless, staring at the empty range, where each target bore the evidence of her quiet dominance. The wind picked up as she turned her back on the field, the rustling of the trees the only noise in the vast open space. She walked toward the barracks, the sounds of boots trailing behind her, the weight of the rifle still pressed gently into her hands, though it had long ceased being a symbol of struggle and had become an extension of herself. For years the rifle had been a constant companion, her ally, her tool, her escape, but today it felt different. It felt like a part of a larger journey. Her steps, slow and deliberate, took her past the soldiers who were now chatting among themselves in small groups, their voices low. She could hear fragments of their conversations, the mixture of awe and disbelief, the realization that they had underestimated her from the start. She could hear the words spoken behind her back, but it didn't matter. It never had. Not anymore. The shock had worn off. What lingered now was a quiet, determined certainty that she no longer needed to prove herself. Aaliyah reached the barracks, her eyes scanning the area before she made her way to the corner where her gear was stored. She set the rifle down, carefully leaning it against the wall. For a brief moment she stood there, hands pressed against the cool metal of the locker, her mind still on the range, on the competition, on everything that had happened. She hadn't expected the sudden shift in the camp's atmosphere, the way the soldiers now regarded her with a certain wariness, a mixture of awe and something else she couldn't quite place. And then there was General Anderson. She hadn't expected his acknowledgement, hadn't expected him to ever admit the truth. The truth that he had been wrong about her from the beginning. The truth that his world, built on assumptions and rank, had crumbled under the weight of her skill. The realization that she, the woman he had mocked, was far more than a passing curiosity. But as much as the general had shifted, Aaliyah knew the journey wasn't over. The path she had walked to this point had been long and fraught with hardship, and though she had reached a milestone, the road ahead was far from clear. The soldiers might have started to see her as one of them, perhaps even respect her for her abilities. But that didn't mean the challenges would stop. In fact, they would only get more complicated. She had proven herself as a sniper, but what about everything else? What about the image of herself that she had carefully constructed, that she had fought for, against every stereotype, every barrier, and every mockery thrown her way? What would happen when the dust settled, when the game was over, and it was time to face the next challenge? The next day, as the camp resumed its normal operations, Aaliyah stood on the edge of the field again, rifle in hand. But this time, it wasn't the same. There was no competition. There was no cheering crowd. It was just her and the endless horizon. She lined up her shot, but her mind wasn't entirely on the target. It never had been, not completely. Her mind was on the next step, the next move, the next fight. She had proven herself to the world, but now it was time to prove herself again. To herself. The quiet moments of reflection were far more complicated than the loud moments of victory. They were where the true challenge lay. In navigating the silent expectations of others, in understanding what it meant to keep pushing forward when the world had stopped doubting you, when the world had already begun to forget the struggle that had brought you here. Aaliyah lowered the rifle slowly, her grip firm but not strained. The rifle was no longer just a tool for hitting a target. It was a reminder that she had always been in control of her fate. A reminder that no one else defined her. She had never been afraid of being underestimated. But she had learned that being underestimated didn't stop her from achieving greatness. If anything, it made her more dangerous. The general had learned that lesson the hard way. Now it was time to learn it again. Only this time, it would be a different kind of test. The soldiers who had once mocked her, who had once questioned her abilities, now looked at her in a way that made Aaliyah feel more like a puzzle than a person. They didn't know how to process her. They couldn't understand how she had come from a place of doubt and despair, and turned it into something so unyielding, so certain. But Aaliyah didn't need them to understand. She didn't need anyone to understand. She only needed herself. Her gaze shifted from the horizon to the few soldiers who were now gathered at the edge of the range, whispering among themselves. The words came in fragments, words she couldn't make out fully, but she didn't need to. Their eyes told her everything. It was different now. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She wasn't the girl who didn't belong. She wasn't the one who had to prove herself to anyone. The people around her knew who she was, and that was enough. But then, just as quickly as the moment settled, the weight of her next task crashed down upon her. The general had been quiet all morning. She had expected the usual condescension, the arrogance, but this morning was different. The air between them had shifted completely. He no longer looked at her with the same disdain, but neither did he look at her with the admiration that most people did when they saw her perform. It was something else, something colder. As she walked toward the training area, she spotted him standing alone, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him as he looked out at the camp. She had known he wouldn't say anything immediately. He never did, but there was a tension in the air now that she hadn't anticipated. It was like a silent battle, one that neither of them had expected, but both of them had to fight. She approached him quietly, standing just a few feet away. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. There was no need for words, not yet. But in that moment, Aaliyah knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the same calm determination that had gotten her this far. She would face the next test. And the next. And the next. And she would pass them all, just like she had done before. In the silence between them, Aaliyah realized that there was one thing the general would never be able to take from her. Respect. The one thing that no amount of mockery or doubt could strip away was her own quiet, unshakable belief in herself. She had earned it not by fighting for recognition, but by simply being who she was, by showing the world in her own quiet way that there was no one like her, and that was enough. Aaliyah woke before the sun rose. the early morning stillness settling over the camp like a soft blanket. She had always been the first one up, always the first to greet the quiet of the world before anyone else had the chance to fill it with noise. The cold air felt sharp against her skin, but she welcomed it. It was familiar. In the silence, she could hear her own thoughts more clearly. She could think without interruption, without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her every word or movement. It had been days since the competition, and in that time, Aaliyah had learned that the world around her had changed in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The soldiers, the officers, they all treated her differently now. But it wasn't out of admiration. No, it was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She walked the grounds of the camp, the familiar path under her boots like a rhythm she had known for years. Each step was deliberate, each movement purposeful. But now there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. She could feel the eyes that followed her, the whispers that came when she passed. They weren't the same as before. They weren't filled with doubt, but there was a weight to them, an expectation. Aaliyah hadn't asked for any of it. She hadn't asked for respect. She hadn't asked for attention. But now that it was there, hanging in the air like a challenge, she realized that it was something she'd have to face. Not head on, not with force, but with the same quiet resolve she had always carried with her. It wasn't her job to explain herself to them. She had done that already. She had proven who she was, and yet there they were, still waiting, still watching, as if expecting her to somehow reveal more of herself. The camp was still waking up, the faint sounds of soldiers beginning their routines filtering through the stillness. Aaliyah stopped at the edge of the training field, her gaze drifting over the rows of targets that stood like silent witnesses to the competition. It felt different now, not because she had conquered it, but because she knew what was at stake. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just a sniper. She was something more. And that realization, though empowering, also felt like a weight she hadn't expected to carry. As she turned to walk back toward the barracks, she felt the familiar presence of the general before she saw him. It was the way he moved, the way the air shifted when he approached. He wasn't the kind of man who crept up on people. His presence was always felt before it was seen. He didn't speak at first, just stood there watching her as if waiting for her to break the silence. Aaliyah didn't acknowledge him immediately. She didn't need to. They both knew what had happened, what had been said, what had been proven. And yet here he was again standing before her. This time, though, it was different. There was no mockery, no false confidence. His expression was unreadable, almost contemplative. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she could sense that the dynamic between them had shifted once again. "You've made quite an impression, Thompson," the general finally said, his voice steady but lacking the arrogance it had once held. His words weren't an insult. They weren't praise either. It was as if he was acknowledging something he had never expected. Aaliyah turned to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. She had done what she had set out to do, but that didn't mean she was ready for what came next. She hadn't anticipated the weight of the role that was now being thrust upon her. She had proven herself as a sniper, but now the camp's perception of her had changed. The other soldiers had seen her as just another face, just another recruit, but now they saw her as something else, something more. "I didn't do it for the impression, sir," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I did it because it's what I do. It's who I am." The general didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were processing her words. For the first time, Aaliyah could see a flicker of respect in his gaze. True respect, not the kind built on rank or authority, but the kind earned through recognition of someone's true worth. He nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. "Fair enough," he said, his voice a little softer than before. "But you've made it clear that you're more than just a good shot, Thompson. You've got the kind of resolve that I haven't seen in a long time, and that's not something I take lightly." Aaliyah said nothing. She didn't need to. His words were enough. She had never expected to hear anything like that from him. She had never expected him to acknowledge her in any way, let alone with such quiet respect. But it was clear that the general now saw her as something else entirely, someone whose presence couldn't be ignored, whose abilities couldn't be denied. The silence stretched between them, the unspoken understanding hanging heavy in the air. Aaliyah knew that there was more to come, more tests, more challenges. The weight of expectations was never going to fade, and she knew that the battles ahead would be different. They wouldn't be the kind of challenges she had faced before. They would be deeper, more complicated. Because now she wasn't just fighting for her place. She was fighting to define it. The general turned, beginning to walk away, but before he reached the edge of the field, he paused. "You're not like the others, Thompson," he said, his back still turned. "And that's exactly why I'm not going to make things easy for you." Aaliyah's gaze followed him as he walked away, her mind processing his words. She wasn't sure what he meant by them, whether they were a challenge, a warning, or a simple truth. But she didn't care. The path ahead was hers to walk, and she had already taken the first step. What came next would be difficult, no doubt, but it wasn't something she feared. Not anymore. She turned back toward the barracks, the rising sun now fully visible, its light breaking over the horizon. She had faced the hardest part. The world had underestimated her, and now it was forced to reckon with the fact that she was more than they had ever imagined. But it wasn't their recognition she sought. It wasn't their approval. It was her own. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles she couldn't yet see. But she wasn't afraid, because Aaliyah had learned something that no one could take from her. The unseen power lay not in the rifle she carried, not in the words others spoke, but in the quiet certainty that she would always rise to meet whatever came her way. She had already proven herself. And now it was time to prove again, not for them, but for her. And this time nothing would stand in her way. The days stretched on, each one folding into the next like an endless series of moments that were both familiar and foreign. Aaliyah had grown accustomed to the quiet weight that now accompanied her every step. The respect from her peers was something she had never asked for, yet it was there, and it had shifted the entire atmosphere of the camp. The once cynical laughter of soldiers now gave way to a murmur of acknowledgement when she passed. It was subtle, but it was there. And though it wasn't exactly comfortable, it was a kind of recognition that she had never expected. But Aaliyah wasn't sure she liked it. In fact, she resented it. Her purpose had always been clear: to do the work, to prove herself, but never to be seen. To remain in the shadows, quiet and unnoticed. That had always been the way. It was simpler that way. No expectations. No judgments. But now, with each day that passed, the eyes of the camp rested heavier on her. The silence of her existence was no longer a shield, but a cage. The mornings, once filled with her solitary routines, now felt different. It wasn't just the stares that came her way, though they were constant. It was the questions, the unspoken ones, that lingered in the air, even when no one dared to ask. Was she here to stay? Was she here to lead? Did they have to listen to her now? Did she owe them something for the skill she had shown? It was these questions that made Aaliyah's stomach twist. She didn't want to lead. She didn't want the responsibility that came with being seen. The rifle, her weapon of choice, had always been a tool of solitude, of personal triumph. It had never been about the eyes on her or the glory that could come from her skill. It was about proving to herself that she could do it, that she could be better than what the world had assumed she was. But now the world, or at least the camp, was starting to see her for something more than what she had been, and Aaliyah wasn't sure she was ready for it. As she stepped onto the training grounds that morning, the familiar sound of boots crunching in the gravel reached her ears. But today, it sounded different. It was too loud, too much. The camp was coming alive around her, the soldiers moving, talking, laughing, but it felt distant, as though she was observing them from far away. The murmur of voices became a hum in the back of her mind, a constant buzz she couldn't shake. She moved to the far edge of the field, away from the rest of the group. She needed space. She needed silence. She needed to remind herself why she was here, why she had fought to get this far. The targets were set up at varying distances, and Aaliyah knew this would be just another morning of her own practice. The rifle felt natural in her hands, as it always did. The pull of the trigger, the steady breath, the focus, these were the things that grounded her. But as she began to set up her stance, she felt it. The presence behind her. The subtle shift in the air. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She had learned to recognize the cadence of footsteps, the heavy, deliberate stride of General Anderson. He was always there now, always lingering in the periphery, watching. Aaliyah hated it. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't ask for any of this, didn't ask for the respect, didn't ask for the eyes on her. She had never cared for being a spectacle. It was simpler before. It was quieter. The competition had been a necessary test, but now that it was over, she longed for the peace that had once been her only companion. The general's footsteps stopped just behind her, but she didn't acknowledge him. She couldn't. She was afraid that if she did, something would shift. If she spoke to him, if she met his eyes, she would have to confront something she wasn't ready to face. She wasn't ready to accept that the game had changed. She wasn't ready to accept that she had changed. He didn't speak at first, but she could feel his gaze on her, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he cleared his throat. "I don't know what it is about you, Thompson. You've got a way of making everything look effortless. But I've been watching you," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I know it's not just your shooting. It's something else. Something they can't teach." Aaliyah's hands tightened around the rifle, but she said nothing. She didn't need to hear more of his words. She had heard enough already. She could feel the weight of his expectations, and she didn't want them. She didn't want to be the person they saw in her. She didn't want to be the one who stood at the top, the one whose abilities defined her. She wanted the quiet again. The general shifted, sensing the tension in the air. "You're not like the others, Thompson," he continued, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "You don't need anyone's approval, and that's what makes you dangerous." Aaliyah turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, but not enough to let her guard down completely. There was something in his eyes now, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pity. It was something more complicated. "You're right," she replied, her voice steady. "I don't need anyone's approval. Not yours, not theirs. I just need to do what I came here to do." The general studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing something in his mind. But he didn't push her any further. He didn't need to. It was clear to him now, just as it had been clear to her for a long time. This was never about them. It was never about proving herself to anyone else. It had always been about the quiet truth she carried with her, that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever believed. But as the general turned and walked away, leaving Aaliyah standing alone on the edge of the field, she realized something. The silent weight that she had carried for so long had changed. The world around her had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the unseen soldier, the one who blended into the background. She was the one they watched, the one they measured themselves against, and that perhaps was the hardest part of all.